Welcome to episode 3 of Trauma, Healing, and Nutrition, a podcast series sponsored by Repair. Repair is a Los Angeles-based health and disability justice organization, and you can connect with us and learn more about us through our website at repairconnect, one word, .org. So repairconnect.org. You will also see links to our social media through Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter, through the main page and at the top bar of our website. And feel free to connect there with us as well in order to learn more about our work, but also get announcements when new podcast episodes are released. So this third episode is titled Hunger is Trauma, and my focus today is going to be in the ways in which hunger itself is traumatic and a form of trauma, and the ways in which experiences of trauma can also escalate the damage caused by hunger. So I want to share a little bit about my relationship to this subject because part of my academic training involved getting my doctorate in sociology and anthropology, and I wrote my dissertation based on 75 interviews with Jewish daughters of Holocaust survivors in the United States. And there were a number of different things that I was deeply concerned with and focused on as I was doing that research. And one of the themes that I think didn't fully anticipate until I got into the study was hunger. As I continued to listen to the narratives that daughters shared about their post-war families' experiences, the impact of parents having, in many instances, partially starved and having been around so many members of their communities starving to death had just tremendous transgenerational consequences. And those consequences could manifest in different ways. Sometimes they showed up as eating disorders. Sometimes they showed up as a preoccupation with feeding other people. I remember interviewing somebody who said, if I know anyone around me is hungry, I can't stand it. I have to get them food. Some talked about the ways in which their parents' tolerance for any sort of physical deprivation, but hunger in particular, was particularly low. And so food was really tied up with families' healing, and sometimes tied up with a lot of pain and dysfunction within families, sort of being pressured to eat or being guilted if you didn't eat everything that you could after so many of your ancestors and family members had gone through starvation. We also know, thanks in large part to a growing field called epigenetics. Think of the letters EPI followed by genetics. So epigenetics is a field that looks at the ways in which a person's DNA can be altered by their social context and environment, and their exposure to different things in the natural environment. So in other words, the basic idea is that what we live through and experience, including trauma and hunger, can change our DNA, and that those changes can be heritable. In other words, they can be inherited or passed down to subsequent generations. So I began to get a picture during and after that research of both the incredibly powerful psychological ways in which the women I was interviewing had been shaped by their parents' generation's exposure to hunger, and also to continue to learn about the ways in which those experiences of hunger and deprivation could be passed on even at a cellular or genetic level, right? Not just a social, cultural, or psychological one. That it was physical and psychological in a wide range of intertwined respects. And I noticed as I did that research that I had some vicarious trauma, not surprisingly, from listening to particularly 75 narratives, some of which were in quite a bit of depth. And one of the ways that I coped with that and that it manifested for me was that I really felt a need to feed people. So one of the ways that I managed stress as I was collecting interviews and listening to people's stories was that then I would invite loved ones over and I would just cook for everybody and feel soothed and grateful getting to watch people I cared about having abundant and ready access to good, tasty, healthy food. And it highlighted for me just how much is almost impossible to put into words about how traumatic the extremes of hunger are, how much they hurt the spirit, the body, and the psyche to not have such a basic need met, that it can be, as not surprisingly, as terrifying, as suffocating, as dehydrating, that it, at the most organic level, calls your existence as a human being into question. So the primary theme of this episode, as noted, is hunger as trauma, and I wanted to just begin with that particular memory of my own immersion with the subject, or one of them. And I want to move next into talking about the fact that the themes that were coming up in my own research are ones that are echoed in other bodies of research that address genocide and colonization. So in preparation for this podcast today, I was reviewing again some of the literature about indigenous experiences of hunger in North America and the ways that that's become vested in communal memory and experiences of trauma. I was looking at a quote today that was along the lines of, "We are the ones who've survived hunger and bullets," as a way of describing what it meant for indigenous people to kind of come through or not come through these continual genocidal encounters with European colonists. And I've also been following for a while some of the literature about the kind of cultural and social legacies of famine in Ireland as, again, another colonized space under British colonialism. And it's often a misunderstanding of the term famine or the term potato famine, that the idea was that the crops just died or didn't grow or something happened so that there just was no food, that it was like an agricultural phenomenon. And the context of what was known as the potato famine was actually that most of the food in Ireland was taken and shipped to England. And so this was an entirely colonially induced phenomenon, not a natural one, and just created such extremes and atrocities of families breaking apart and dying and losing children and sometimes killing each other and going through just unbearable traumatic events because colonization had taken their food. And what we see when we listen to cultural scholars from a variety of disciplines who are engaged with, not just scholars, artists, community-based, not necessarily academic historians, poets, all the people who are keepers of memory and experience, what we find is that the memory of trauma is indelible and embodied in collective and communal experiences, and it tends to go with most, if not all, experiences that people have had of colonization, that one of the ways that you colonize a people is you control their access to food. It's so basic and it's so powerful. And if you control people's access to food, the level of intervention and discipline and control that you can exercise over a human body is that much more powerful and that much more traumatic. So all of this is, understanding hunger as a mass social and historical phenomenon. And I also want to talk a little bit today, at least just to sort of tease out a little bit of the subject, we won't go deep, about the ways that we know that hunger can also work in the body and interact with various sources of trauma. So there was a study that came out just a couple years ago by Andrew D. Jones. This was in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And anytime I'm citing to a specific author, you'll be able to find the full citation in text associated with this podcast. So if you want to go and actually look it up, you can. And he was writing about the relationship between food insecurity and mental health, and he analyzed the issue based on data from 149 countries. And as you might expect, what he found was that food insecurity was massively associated, really significantly associated with poor mental health status. That hunger doesn't just make you physically deprived, that it makes you psychologically ill. And I'm oversimplifying that a little because, basically what we're describing is a correlation, meaning two things being associated. So sometimes hunger and other declines in mental health were both associated with something else, like war or poverty. But even when we control for all of that, what we find is that hunger predictably is going to keep being associated regardless of the different contexts that produce it. Hunger is associated with declining mental health. So hunger in and of itself is not just physically, but always emotionally traumatic, at least when it's present for any significant period of time. One of the ways to understand why that is, beyond what I've already said, is indicated in an existing area of study that focuses on the way in which trauma escalates weight loss. So we all understand pretty intuitively that if you don't have enough food to eat, eventually that will mean you start losing weight. But one of the things that we see is that even in the presence of nutrient deprivation, when you're being severely traumatized, it will disrupt your ability to digest and absorb the nutrients you are getting. And so trauma by itself, even among people who have enough food, can generate weight loss. When you combine hunger with heavy levels of traumatic stress. And for instance, I was looking today at a study from by Setker et al. In 1990 that was basically in clinical psychology and was focused on prisoners of war. And what you find is that when trauma from multiple sources is interacting with hunger, that you get an escalated weight loss effect, that it's both the trauma and the food deprivation that starve you. So that's useful to understand as well. And it indicates something very important, which is that when you want to help a body heal from hunger, you have to address trauma in order to not just provide food, in order to restore that body's ability to fully make use of the nutrients it's finally getting and to heal. Otherwise, weight loss may still continue for too long, or the body just may not be able to fully repair itself. There's one more really interesting and important study I want to discuss, and this was by two scholars by the last names of Chilton and Booth. It was published in the Journal of Nutrition, Education, and Behavior a little over 10 years ago in 2007. And what they did in this study was go to 3 food pantries in Philadelphia and focus on African American women's narratives about hunger. And from that study, they devised a conception of hunger of the body and hunger of the mind. So what they found was that the women were describing being hungry physiologically, but also having an experience of starving emotionally, and that both forms of hunger, emotional hunger and physical hunger, were often linked to their vulnerability to interpersonal violence. Right? That your heart, your spirit, your mind are starving for the things you need to heal and to be safe, and your body is starving. And both of those things are occurring because you're somebody who's a victim of violence. And I thought that was really, really important as well, because it helps us have an expanded conception of hunger in which, again, we can think of hunger as trauma. And trauma as something that also makes you, in one sense or another, hungry, deprived. And that can starve your body even when you're getting food by disrupting your digestion. So if you've listened before, you know that I try to end each episode with some discussion of what we can do about what actions we can take to make use of the information in the podcast. And I'll note that one of the ways to powerfully work through and release some of our trauma involves the telling of our experiences, narrative, storytelling. So when we think about how can you help a person heal from the trauma of hunger, one of the storytelling is healing in and of itself. It also can illuminate and politicize the origins of hunger. And that can help promote and provoke people to engage in broader advocacy and